Hi, welcome to Board Gems. This is my weekly video series in which I go over an older board game gem, one that maybe people have kind of moved on from in the hobby. I want to say up front, I'm not much of a wargamer. I do have a wargame shelf of sorts, which is right here. You'll see what has most recent edition would be the 1759 Siege of Quebec from Worthington Games, but a lot of GMT games, a lot of Commands and Colors Napoleonics, and I know Thunder Alley isn't a war game, but it's a GMT game, and it looks nice next to the other GMT games. And this one, Manoeuvre, or Manoeuvre. I may call it Manoeuvre for the rest of this video. It's designed by Jeff Horger, published by GMT, I think originally in 2008. This is the second printing from 2010. It's for 2 players only. The box says ages 12 and up, probably pretty fair. Takes about an hour. What's special about Manoeuvre? Well, a lot of games focus on a particular conflict or a particular war, and a lot of war games focus on a particular battle. Now, those are great for deep dives, right? You really want to know about, the Battle of Waterloo or the Battle of Gettysburg. You can dig right in, try different strategies, just as if the generals would have done. And those games can be a little less abstract. If you have a system for replicating many different types of battles, then of course the game is going to become more abstract. If you're recreating specific battles, but you want a system to represent all of them, then you'll have something like the Commands and Colors series, of which Napoleonics is my favorite. But you can go even more abstract. In a game like Manoeuvre, this is not actually duplicating any specific battles of history. It is set in the Napoleonic times, and the box contains 8 different armies for 2-player skirmish battles, I guess you would say. I don't know if skirmish is the right word, but they're not like big grand battles. They're more they feel like kind of smaller, more intimate battles, kind of smaller scale, but not replicating anything real from history. So it's much more abstracted out than a lot of war games are. I'll show you how it plays first, kind of give you a feel for it. Then I'll talk more about why it's a gem. Setting up Manoeuvre, there's kind of 2 different ways to do it. The way in the rule book is very precise and is, I think, designed to accommodate tournament play. For casual play, you don't really have to worry about that so much. I'll go over kind of a casual setup. So just shuffle all the map tiles, like so. Shuffle them up, and then set up just a random 4. Then you'll need to decide which of the 8 armies the players are going to use. Now, this is where handicapping comes in. If one player is better than the other, then they should use a worse team. And the rule book gives a list and the order in terms of which is considered stronger and which is considered weaker. It's the final tiebreaker. Note that in the expansion, actually, they revised the Ottomans to be actually stronger than they implied in the original rule book. A lot of cavalry. If you can play it well, the Ottomans are not that bad. So you want to kind of pick 2 armies that reflect the different levels of familiarity that the 2 players have. So if a player is completely new to Manoeuvre, you probably want to give them the French or the British. And if you're an experienced player, you'll want something that's going to be a little bit harder to use. So each army has a deck of cards, as well as 8 units. And if you have a look at a unit, the most important information is just a number on it, which is the strength of the unit. I think 8 is the strongest I've seen, and each unit can take 2 hits. The first time a unit is hit, you'll be flipping it over, and you'll see it's kind of striped now, instead of what was a solid back. So this is striped, and you'll see the number is now weakened. If a weakened unit was hit again, it would be eliminated. Now, before setup, each player is going to shuffle up their deck of cards and draw a hand of 5. And it's based on that 5, they get to look at those cards and then decide how to set up their units. So they can see what armies they may have in their starting hand. And once both players have their starting hand, then they set up their counters. Certainly one way to kind of try to balance it a little bit is to have the stronger army set up completely first, so that the weaker army can then set up in response to that. We usually do is the first player will set up the first 4 units, then the second player will set up all 8, and then the first player the remaining 4. And when you're setting up the units, they will always go in spaces on the first 2 rows. So we're going to say this is the French side and this is the British side. So the player looks at their cards and then decides how they want to set up. Now, it's a battle game, so the winner of the game is the player who wins the battle. A player wins the battle if they are able to eliminate 5 of their opponent's 8 units. Now remember, a unit can take 2 hits. So if this unit is hit once, you would flip it over. If it's hit again, it's eliminated. Play is going to go back and forth turn by turn until one player is able to eliminate the 5 of their opponent's units, in which case they win, or both players run out of their decks. And different players may use up their decks at different speeds. When the first player runs out of their deck, they're going to shuffle up all their discards and continue, and the game will continue until the other player runs out of their deck. Then the day is over. And then we look at victory points. And victory points are basically how many spaces on your opponent's side of the board you have sort of control over. So obviously these 4 rows are the British territory and these 4 rows are the French territory. Any spaces on this side that are controlled by the French count as a victory point. And to count as a victory point, it must either be under such a unit or next to, adjacent to the unit, and not adjacent to the enemy unit. So the way to look at it is, right now, France has 3 victory points. 1 for this space that they're on top of, and also 2 more points for these 2 spaces, because they are adjacent to them. They're adjacent to this one too, but so is the British. So you can consider that space kind of contested. Neither player controls that space. But these 3 spaces are uncontested. The French definitely own those. That's 3 victory points for France. So you compare the victory points, and the player with the most victory points wins. So it is possible that at the end of the game, if it looks like there aren't going to be 5 eliminations on a side, that you might see some units, especially some cavalry, just trying to bolt through the lines and claims a bunch of victory points in the back. Now, it's important to understand how the cards work. So most of the cards show an army. So in this case, this is the 45th Regiment de Ligne, right here. And it has an attack value and a defense. Now, this value that's on the counter is its base value for attack or defense. You can play this card to improve its defense by 5, or to add 2d6 to its attack. That is to say, roll 2 6-sided dice. There's 6-sided dice, and 8-sided dice, and 10-sided dice. So you can roll to see who's the start player. Start player will get a little first player marker there. And one rule that was introduced in the expansion, which I recommend to speed up the start of the game, the start player will move 3 units, and then the opponent will do 3 units, and then each player will do 2 units, and then starting with the 3rd turn on, each player will move 1 unit. A turn starts like this. So a player is going to have a number of cards in their hand. At the start of their turn, they can choose to discard any number of cards that they want, and they would discard the cards face up, but only 1 card can be seen. So I just discarded 3 cards, but you as my opponent would only see the top one. And then draw back up to 5. And then with this hand, you do 1 move and potentially 1 attack. And then finally is the restoration phase. Importantly, at the end of your turn, you do not draw cards. So if you use a lot on your turn, you're not going to have much to defend with for your opponent's turn. So moving a unit, there's 2 types of units. There's infantry and there's cavalry. Infantry moves 1 space, cavalry up to 2. And you have to move a unit, always. Movement is always cardinal directions, north, south, east, or west. There's never diagonal movement. And you don't have to play any cards to move units, but you do have to play cards to attack. Now you move a unit and then you may attack with a unit. You don't have to attack with the same unit you moved. To attack, always you play a single card matching the unit you're going to attack. And for almost all attacks, I mean, the basic attack is what's called an assault, and that's when the 2 units are adjacent to each other. So you might have something like this, for example. The attacker will play a card of the unit that is doing the attacking. So in this case, the defender sees this card, and the attack is going to be 2d6, so 2 6-sided dice, plus the base value of the unit, which in this case is 6. So 2d6 plus 6. The defender's value currently is 6. Now the defender has the option of playing cards, and they can play as many cards as they want, or none at all. The cards would usually have to be of the unit type. So for example, if France was the defender here, France could play this card to add defense of 5. Then, after the defender has played as many cards as they want, then the attacker can play as many cards as they want. That's important. The attacker plays 1 card. The defender doesn't know how big this attack is going to be. The defender plays as many cards as they want, and then the attacker plays the remaining cards. The attacker could have more units. The attacker could play them all, and all those values are going to be added to the attack. Or you can have a leader. The biggest thing is command. You can always play a leader to add combat value as defense or attack. The command value is how many units this leader can control, basically, in a joint attack. So if they look something like this, for example, right? This player plays this card. So right now the attack is 6 plus 2d6. But the defender, this unit here, the Briton, is worried because this unit is also adjacent. Now this unit is not involved in the attack right now. After the defender plays as many cards as they want, then the attacker can bring in more cards. They could bring in more cards of the same unit to add to its attack value, but they can also play leaders to bring in more units. In this case, this leader has a command of 2. That means they can control 2 units. If France were to play this leader, then they would not only be bringing in this attack value, but also this attack value. So right now, the attack is 2d6 plus 11. Then the attacker could bring in unit cards of that unit they're bringing in. So right now, this attack is 11 plus 4d6. It's a big attack. Now, terrain does contribute. So this town that the defender is in will add some bonus. And units that are in hills also get bonuses to defense and attack out of a hill. So a unit in a hill attacking out of a hill will actually get a bonus to attack. So after all the cards have been played on both sides, then it's time for the dice to be rolled. And that value is compared to the defensive value. So in this case, let's give it a try. This is 4d6 plus 11. So we got 10 and 13 plus 11, 24. How powerful the attack is depends on how much higher the attack value is to the defense value. If the attack value ended up being smaller than the defense value, then the attacker would have to take a hit. I think all the units involved would have to take a hit in this case. If it's a tie, then there's no damage. If the attacker is able to get higher than the defender, then the defender gets to choose to either take a hit, at which point they flip their counter over, or withdraw. They can retreat. If they withdraw, they always have to move 1 space back toward their side if they're able to. A lot of the cavalry units have what's called a pursuit value. If a unit withdraws, one of the attacking units must enter that space. And if that unit, usually a cavalry, has a pursuit value, then they would get to do kind of a parting attack on the defender as they're withdrawing. And in this case, the pursuit value is 1 to 4. They would roll 1d6, and on a value of 1 to 4, they would get a bonus hit in. Even though they retreated, they still get hit because the cavalry were able to pursue them. Generally, that's not optional. The unit has to enter, one of the units involved in the attack has to enter the space. Now, the defender gets to choose, unless the attack is twice as much as the defense. If it's twice as much or more, then the attacker gets to choose. Take a hit or withdraw. Maybe the attacker wants the defender to back off so they can get into this town. They may choose to withdraw. Especially if they have cavalry and they want to do a pursuit, they may choose to withdraw so that they can use their pursuit value and try to get a hit in anyway. Unless the attack is 3 times or more. If the attack is 3 times or more, then both happens. The unit has to withdraw and the unit gets a hit. Both happen. Well, guess what happens if it's 4 times, which is exactly what it was here. Was this my roll? So this was 13 plus 11, 24 versus 6, 4 times. In the case of an attack value 4 times the defense value, the unit is just completely eliminated. Even though it hasn't been weakened yet, it hasn't had any hits on it, doesn't matter. 2 hits, it's gone. It's done. There are lots of special cards. For example, once the attacker plays its first card, if this player is worried and they have one of these, they can play it, a withdraw. They just retreat before the battle happens. And that can actually be fun too, because if it's something like this, say, let's say it looks something like this, and the French player plays this attack, then the British player plays a withdraw. This unit backs up. This unit has to enter the space that it was left. Maybe the British have some attack cards for the first foot guards, these guys, and then can attack them. Maybe they have a leader and they can bring in both these units, so you can actually withdraw, bringing the enemy kind of into a trap. You can do real fun stuff like that. What are some other cards? Skirmish, this is a fun one. After the attacker plays the card, and then the defender plays all their cards, the attacker can then go, oh, nope, I'm canceling my attack. So maybe the defender was worried about a big attack coming, and then the defender played all these cards to increase the defense, and the attacker is like, nope, skirmish. And the attacker actually gets to take their card back, and the attack is cancelled. There are different attacks. This is a bombard. And a bombard is a long-distance attack. It's up to 2 spaces. You can see range 2. This card could also be used for its defense, but you can also bombard. This unit couldn't bombard this one. 2 spaces away, 1, 2. You always have to draw a path. This path would be going through hills, so you couldn't trace that path. But you could still bombard going this way. But if there was a unit here, for example, this player wouldn't be able to bombard this one because the view is blocked. They can bombard this, of course. And in that case, it's simply an attack of 1d10. So it could be 1, could be 10. Not very effective against this unit, which has a value of 8. But especially weaker units that have been hit, bombards and volleys, which are like bombards but just with a range of 1 and usually more powerful, can really wipe out an already weakened unit. There are also ambush cards, which you can use to just target any unit on the board. Again, you want to use those to pick off the weakened units. So after the move is the attack, and then after the attack is I forget what they call it, the restoration phase, the reinforcement phase. Players can play a bunch of different cards. Can play a card to add a readout, so you can actually add one of these tokens under a unit to add 3 to their defensive value, like that. You can also try to heal a unit. If a unit is weakened, you can try to heal it a few different ways. If you have this unit card in your hand, you can play it, and then you would be able to flip it back. There are also special cards called supply cards, which can be used to either move an extra unit during the movement phase, or, again, to heal a unit. Now, these are susceptible to guerrilla cards. If the other player has a guerrilla card in their hand, they can play it, and it cancels the healing. No healing happens. That's called the restoration phase. So a turn is that. It's discard as many cards as you want, then draw up to 5, move a unit, attack with a unit, and then restore. And then it's the other player's turn. Remember, you do not draw cards at the end of your turn, only at the beginning after you've had a chance to discard more. And the game will continue like that until either one player loses 5 units eliminated, that player loses, or if that doesn't happen, then when all the decks run out. So when one player runs out of their deck of cards, they're going to reshuffle all their discards, form a new deck, play continues until the other player runs out their deck. Then that's considered the end of the day. And then you look at victory points. So again, victory points are how many spaces on your opponent's side that you have control over. If it looks something like this, France would have 2 victory points and Britain 1. This is the victory point Britain has, because this unit is basically controlling or attacking this unit and this space, and there's no units defending it. So this is 1 point for Britain. But France has this space and this space. That's 2 victory points. These 2 don't count because also the British are defending those spaces. Neither side has more control over the space than the other, so those spaces don't count as victory points. And the player with the most victory points wins. In the case of a tie, the player who has the more units left on the board wins. If that's a tie, then the player who has the stronger units wins. By stronger, I mean not hurt. So the player who has the fewer hit, injured, weakened units wins. And if it's still a tie, then you look at the list of relative strengths of the units. And the weaker unit, as defined in that list, will always beat the stronger unit. Obviously, there's more details. I kind of skimmed over some stuff, but that's generally it. And now you're basically ready to play Manoeuvre. Any review that I do of a war game should start with the caveat, I am not a wargamer. Wargaming is a genre that and I think a lot of board gamers who aren't wargamers necessarily like to kind of dip our toes in and find there must be some war games that we would like, that I would like. I just need to try different ones. So I always focus on kind of the simple, approachable war games. And I've tried a number, and a lot of them just weren't for me. This is a war game unlike any other, and that's why I really want to talk about it this week. War games, at some point, abstract down, and the bigger, complicated war games abstract very little. They try to capture as much of the details as possible, and to make the game simpler, but also to make the game be able to accommodate multiple battles, it has to go more abstract. So, for example, Commands and Colors, which is able to reproduce many different battles and many different scales. But as a result, they have to abstract some things out. And this is possibly one of the most abstract war games you can get. At least one that I would still categorize as a war game. And it's so abstracted to the point that the battles don't even have to represent real battles. It can be random terrain, 2 random armies, go at it, right? So you could describe it as just sort of a generic battle game. One that does ostensibly take place in the Napoleonic era and does have some of those trappings. It is abstract, and the appearance of it really evokes chess, which I have to wonder if that was or wasn't intentional. It looks like if chess was a war game. And it has a lot of arithmetic in it. So it's almost, this is going to be a loaded phrase, don't take it too far. It's almost as if someone like Reiner Knizia had designed a full-on proper war game. Now, lots of Knizia fans out there, myself included, if you're one of those, you're probably hearing, oh, I have to get this. No, hold on. It's not really anything like Reiner Knizia. I just mean it reminds me of some of his games, like one of my favorites, Kingdoms, which I did a video on earlier in the year, in that it has a lot of arithmetic. And if you don't like games with a lot of arithmetic, you probably want to steer clear of this one too. But the not the scoring necessarily, but yeah, how the battles are resolved does feel very, oh, this word, here it comes. Are you ready? Elegant. I know I get goosebumps whenever I hear that word because it's so overused, and I feel used in the wrong ways. But in this case, I feel like it does apply. For a war game, it feels very elegant. It has a very simple battle resolution that creates a huge amount of tension. The attacker only plays a single card, and from that one card, the defender has to choose what to do. They may have a withdraw card to retreat. They might have more cards they could throw down to increase their defense value. But the point is, the defender doesn't know how big that attack's going to be. Maybe that one card is all there is. But if the defending unit is adjacent to other units that could come into the attack on the opposing side, then this could be a massive attack, and you're only seeing that initial thrust. So you have to decide how much you want to defend. If you say, okay, I'm not going to defend anything, I'm not going to play any cards, and then suddenly the attacker brings in a leader and 2 other army cards, and it's like, oh my god. So it creates a great amount of tension there, and lots of opportunities to cheer and groan, right? Like when you do a big attack and it succeeds, you really feel like you accomplished something. And if you're defending and the attacker is bringing in a whole bunch of extra cards at the end to make the attack 3 times bigger than you thought it would be, then you're like, oh no, right? And you want a game that has those sorts of highs and lows, those high and low feelings, right? That give you opportunities to feel happy and maybe a little bit frustrated or disappointed, right? It's like, oh, this didn't go the way I had hoped. It really captures those feelings really well, and you want that kind of tension. The name is really appropriate because in this game, positioning is super important. There's the terrain, which obviously grants bonuses. A lot of games have terrain bonuses, right? But also, you don't want to have any of your armies kind of sticking out too far by itself. You ideally want to have a bit of a line, because if one is kind of overextended, your opponent may try to surround it. And then if they have a leader, they can bring in multiple units, poof, right? So it's a very dangerous position to be in. But if they're in a defensive position, like if they're in a town or a forest or on top of a hill, maybe you feel a little more confident there. Maybe you've built a redoubt, so that's increased the defense a little bit as well. A lot of the positioning of your units in the game relative to each other and relative to the terrain on the map is extremely important. And there is a fair amount of positioning, of movement, maneuvering of your units to try to get them to surround other units. That's a big part of it as well. So the name is really good. There's a great and interesting choice about choosing whether to hit or retreat. And that can also come into play in terms of the terrain. So if you're the defender and the attacker won the attack, but just by a bit, you as a defender have the choice whether to hit or take the hit or retreat. And there are multiple factors that you have to think about when you make that decision. For one thing, maybe you're on a defensive position that you feel is really important, so you'd rather take the hit and hang on to that position rather than give it up to your opponent, because if you withdraw, your opponent is going to enter that space. And maybe your opponent is cavalry, and they will actually have a chance to attack you as you're retreating and get a hit that way. So whereas you could just guarantee the hit, or you could retreat and take the risk that you might get a hit anyway, right? So these choices really, really come into play. And of course, you can withdraw, drawing the opposing unit toward you, because when you withdraw, the attacker has to come into that space. But maybe by doing so, you're able to surround that unit with more of your own, and then you can have a big counterattack afterwards. So these are all factors. They really come into play. Even as the attacker, you have that choice. If you are able to win the battle by a ratio of 2-1, instead of the defender choosing, you choose whether the defender takes a hit or retreats. And again, you have those same decisions. If they're in just a regular space, you may want them to take the hit because ultimately that's more progress. But you don't know. Your opponent may have the ability to rally and bring that unit back up to full health the turn after, at which point your attack was wasted. If they're in a strong defensive position, you may want them to retreat and not stay put, because then you can move into that defensive position, that town or that forest. And then you'll benefit. Obviously, you've also progressed toward your opponent's side, and that's progress in that aspect. So it really has a great just balance of decisions to make and tension. There's a huge amount of variety in the box, okay? The game comes with 8 armies and 32 map tiles, which means you could actually have 4 two-player games running side by side if you want to, all in this one box. Now, the armies aren't balanced. They range from the French on one end, the strong end, versus I think the Americans are in the sort of last place, like I guess it would be more of like, you know, just early American militia. That's a lot of handicapping that you can introduce as well. If one player is much stronger than the other, maybe the other player is new and the first player is more experienced, but say you're more experienced, you can say, okay, you play as the French. I'll play as, I don't know, the Spanish or something, right? And that's a handicapping built right into the game, because the weaker player or the less experienced player is playing the stronger army. If you want a completely balanced game, you can pick 2 armies that are close to each other, like the French and the British, for example, and it's not 100% balanced. There's still one stronger than the other, but the luck in the game will probably have more an effect than those differences. I would almost argue that if you're not a wargamer, but you're interested in dipping your toes and you want a single wargame, you could consider either a Commands and Colors game or Manoeuvre. And Manoeuvre has so much variety, like I said, right out of the box. There is a really big random element. In the end, you're rolling dice, and they're D6s, D8s, D10s. And so, again, opportunities to cheer and groan, right? If you take a risk on an attack and you roll really well, you're pretty happy, right? And if you have a big attack lined up and you roll and the dice are bad, you know, they're all low results, and you're like, oh my God, you know, just cursing the bad luck. Yeah, luck is a factor. And I would almost argue luck was probably a factor in real life battles of this era too. Not everything is predictable, right? But you have to accept that going in as another source of excitement. The game has those highs and lows, right? You could have the best laid plan and it falls through due to roll of the dice. I would argue that there is enough dice rolls, because every attack involves dice. So over the course of the game, the dice are rolled enough that the luck will kind of balance out. There are elements in the game that, I mean, I'm not qualified to say they're realistic. Obviously, the game is very abstracted, but they're believable, and I can insert them into a realistic historical context. If I can use a word, it has verisimilitude, right? It has that believability, right? Or at least it has elements that I can put in my brain and rationalize. Oh, it's like this because this. And one example is bombardments and ambushes. So these are rarely work against a strong unit. The strongest units are 7 or 8 in strength, and bombards are usually a 1d10. And you have to beat the result, right? You have to be higher in order for it to do anything. Ambushes, I think, are usually 1d10 as well. So trying a bombardment or an ambush on a strong, what I guess they would say is in the wargame hobby is a cohesive unit, you know, like they're very confident, they're working well together as a group. It's unlikely to work. They're prepared. But they're very effective against weakened units, especially, you know, units that weren't really all that strong to begin with, and maybe they were hit once. So now their strength is 3 or 4, and now those are looking to be more successful. And again, that kind of makes sense, right? First of all, they weren't the most well-disciplined unit to begin with. That's why they had a low strength. They were already hit once. Maybe, you know, if you try to rationalize it, you're picturing that these guys are not very cohesive right now, right? They've already taken a hit. You know, they're lacking confidence. They're not working well now together as a unit because they've lost so many of their armies. And, you know, one good attack could just finish them off, right? And then that ambush comes out of nowhere and they're wiped out. So it has these sorts of elements that fit in really nicely. And at least for me, I can rationalize them and say, that really makes sense. If I picture this as a real battle, that really makes sense. Once you internalize the rules, it flows really, really nicely. I think it's also an interesting design decision, the idea of you can choose how fast to run through the deck. So my son and I, for example, use different strategies. And by the way, his is more successful. Whereas I'll get a hand of cards and I'll have, single army cards for like 3 different armies. But I'll want to use them. So like, okay, I'll get these into position. I'll try to, I don't want to waste them. So I'll attack with them. Maybe I'll get lucky. My son has no problem discarding cards, even good cards, that he doesn't 100% need right now. Like, he's got a plan. He knows what he wants to do. He wants to do an attack with this unit. He has 1 attack card. He wants more. He's going to discard almost everything else. Draw up to 5 and hope to get more of that to make the attack more powerful. It's different strategies, and there are pros and cons for both. I'm not sure I'm skilled enough to justify one or the other, but I will say my son wins more often than I do. But that's an interesting kind of, again, there's a depth in that game, right? Whereas you can kind of choose how fast to go through that deck depending on your play style. Do you want to kind of skirmish? Do you want to do like many light attacks and just hope, that you'll get lucky on some of them? Or do you want to throw away good cards to try to build that one big attack? So I should talk about the expansion a bit. They made one expansion called Distant Lands, which, if you were to hear a description of it, would sound like a must-buy for fans of Manoeuvre. So you have 8, in the base game you have 8 armies, and I think 32 map tiles. Well, Distant Lands adds another 4 armies, so more variety, right? That's great. You like Dominion, great, but throw in some expansions, now you got a huge amount of variety. So to have 4 more armies, that's great. Yes and no. So for one thing, these 4 armies skew on the weaker side, definitely. There's Sweden, and then there's China, Japan, and India, basically. I mean, there's specific like dynasties, but I forget what they are at the moment. But they're all pretty weak. Again, it's great for additional handicapping because, for example, the Indian and the Japanese armies have extra restrictions on how to use their leaders. That can make it challenging to play as those. So if you're a very experienced player, here you have almost extra weak armies that you can do additional handicapping with and introduce more challenge. Oh my god, how am I going to beat the Russians with this, right? Distant Lands is a little bit of a tricky expansion to recommend because it does have more armies, but they're all on the weak side, and they introduce more challenge for the player playing as them. So again, probably good for additional handicapping if you want to play somebody very strong versus very, very weak. Have them play as one of these new weaker teams, have the other play as the French. So you could have a wider range of handicapping. So I don't know, my personal point of view, don't worry about getting the expansion. The base game has a lot of variety in it already. It does have some elements that are worth introducing into your regular base game of Manoeuvre, like an ability to speed up the start of the game, which is very welcome. But it's not necessary at all. There is a new version of this. This is now, once again, on the GMT P500 pre-order system. So you can pre-order it. Your credit card is not charged unless they get a certain number of pre-orders. And right now the number of pre-orders is really low. At the time of recording, I think it's just like maybe 70 or so. And they need 500 for a reprint. They are going to improve the quality. One thing is that the counters are fine, but they did say they are going to increase the thickness of the counters. But in particular, the map tiles are really, really thin, and they are going to increase the thickness for the new edition. So if you're at all interested in this game, consider backing it on the GMT P500 series. Thanks for watching. Remember, older games like Manoeuvre don't stop being good just because new games come out. Take care.